Welcome back to another episode of Home Court Health. I'm your host, Tom Foolery, and delighted to be back in the saddle to share some reflections that I recently posted via Substack as an article. And it's been my habit it's been a habit that I'm training to not overthink and over edit, whether it's podcasts or written pieces, really anything that I create and put out there. I'm still greasing the grooves to just send it out and not keep it in the back of the library for too long. So the reason why I'm sitting down today to read this article and provide some extra commentary and context is because this could have been a much longer piece, and I'm just not feeling very academic at the moment, to the point where, and this is something I love about Substack, is that there are academicians, people with the critical, analytical writing background or journalistic background, to bring in sources and links and tables and imagery and videos and put all of that into their articles. It's something that I aspire to. And still, like I said, I mean, for right now, for me, I just got to let it rip. And so this could have been a much more detailed and structured article with a lot more context, which is what I'm bringing to it today. And it's called School is No Place for Learning. And I could even amend the title to say A School is No Place for Learning, because school, I mean, can take place anywhere. I mean, so there's homeschooling, there's Waldorf schooling, there's Montessori, there's thankfully more options now than ever. And I know there have been options throughout all time. And as a bit of a preface and maybe a spoiler, the thesis of this article is that the school system, because it is a system, is not conducive to real learning. Because, as I've said many a time, my education took place, and I mentioned this in the article, my education has taken place every day since I left school, because I've been able to, without the rigidity and without the constant feedback of right versus wrong. And I've mentioned this before, the idea of right versus wrong is not just incorrect versus correct. There's connotations there, subtle connotations to good and bad. Right and wrong, we use that term in reference to justice or to law. And so for a child to be constantly reinforced with whether or not they're answering rightly or wrongly, correctly, incorrectly, that is a massive limitation to what I believe is the birthright of any child. And part of those, especially those years 0 to 7 and even 7 to 14, developmentally, to, yes, you get some feedback, but really only insofar as does it work, does it make sense, and to bounce back accordingly. And instead, what we get is this excuse me, this environment which is, it doesn't really support growth. Growth happens almost by accident. And as I mentioned in the article, there are these factors that keep children from blossoming into adults. And a lot of this was inspired by my recent foray into the work of John Taylor Gatto. I've heard enough people that I admire and respect speak about him with similar respect and admiration. So I thought may as well see what it's all about. And I'll be linking in the show notes to this exceptional 5-part interview. It's nearly 5 hours long that he did with a journalist whose name I do not know. And credit to that journalist, because he seemed to really perform as a journalist. And we're so used to podcasts and the free-form nature of podcasts that maybe we don't quite appreciate journalism as we used to, especially in the form of an interview. Wide open questions with purposes, with themes every time you sit down. And certainly as a journalist, there's really no interrupting unless it is for desired clarity, which is useful, of course. And still, I was profoundly impacted by Gatto's delivery, his erudition, his mastery of the English language as a teacher. And so I won't make this preamble too much about him, because you can do all that with an internet search, with reading any of his books, which seem quite digestible, and this interview series that I'm going to link to as well. Highly informative, and without further ado, let me get into, or I'll get into my writing here, because there are plenty of references to Gatto in this interview, and I'd like to expound on that as we go. So the banner of this is a quote from the ancient historian Plutarch, which reads, "The mind is not a vessel to be filled, but a fire to be lit." And I discovered this quote many years ago now, and it always resonated with me because that's exactly how I feel. And we stoke that flame. We can pour gasoline on it. Sometimes we douse it with a little bit of water, and still that fire is quite resilient. But the idea that the mind is a vessel, the brain, because that's where so much of the infatuation is now, is with the brain organ and the alleged biochemistry, that there's just these reactions that therefore create memory and learning and information retention and skill building, etc. The mind is something else entirely. The mind has much more to do. We talk about the mind body. The mind has much more to do with access to the ether, to things that go beyond just our, sometimes just our senses, although our senses impact so much of how we interact with reality, or at least they should, because part of schooling is denying your senses and things that do or do not make sense, rejecting those in favor of narratives and stories that support the status quo. And so, but even just the idea that we're going to cram the brain full of as much as it can handle, the idea of bandwidth, is not, from my perspective, excuse me, indicative of the almost unlimited, limitless capacity of the mind, because it just goes far beyond whatever the brain is reasoned to do, just as a functionary organ. So, to begin, there is a creeping sense of cliche to say that words have power to create our reality. I feel as though I've gone hoarse, almost literally right now, from shouting that mantra, imploring people to sharpen their awareness of what spells they cast from their lips every time they criticize, judge, deplore, or denigrate themselves or others. It is, I find, surprisingly common parlance to use acutely negative language to describe the events of our everyday lives. This is a category in which ignorance appears to be the root cause rather than malice. However, ignorance can be manufactured through assumptions that populate those shared environments in which we are reared and reprimanded to conform. So I, for any regular listeners here, frequently speak about those catching ourselves employing acutely negative language to talk about ourselves. It's so common on the tennis court. It's so common just in general. Even to just say, I've never been good at this, or I'll never be good at that. I've always been this way, and those are just shackles on our human experience. And of course, it's almost probably just as easy to do that about other people, or about the state of affairs in the world is messed up and it's crazy and it's insane and there's so much evil, and that will create the way in which you see the world. So I think plenty of that has been learned helplessness, and ignorance in general, which I'm about to explore more here. That is something that is taught. That is something that people are reminded of constantly. I feel like from the schooling days, and then just how we compare ourselves to other people based on their expert status or their credentials and things like that, and that is a misconception of our ignorance. And then there is a genuine ignorance just from being told that what other potential versions of history or philosophy or human relations, anything like that, people are steered away from that rather deliberately, and therefore they have a learned ignorance. Continuing here. I have thoroughly been enjoying my introduction to the work of John Taylor Gatto, who provides critical historical perspective on education and literacy in America. Both education and literacy have rapidly devolved to the point of infantilism, where the ability to communicate in coherent, impactful ways is now a rarity. I choose to accept the challenge of righting that ship, because I see the necessity for wielding the power of words once more in favor of peace and prosperity. This warrants a maturation, a growth beyond ourselves and our immediate reactions, honing the ability to state our beliefs, intentions, and purposes clearly. Otherwise, we wail and flail to no avail. And so the reason I make such a fine point here about education and literacy is Gatto brings up the point that the publication of Common Sense, written by Thomas Paine in the 1770s on the precipice of war, as propaganda. I mean, propaganda is not all bad. It is something that propagates. It is something that brings a new narrative into play. And I mean, I've read it, I think, piecemeal over the years, and I'll bring in at least one quote that I really enjoy from that. Yeah, I mean, this is akin to Plutarch for sure, that Thomas Paine writes in Common Sense, "The mind once enlightened cannot again become dark." And so similar themes, obviously, and Paine, I'm sure, was inspired by Plutarch, although apparently he did not have formal education, and I'll speak about that in a moment. But this is one of the gems, certainly, from Common Sense. What we obtain too cheap, we esteem too lightly. It is dearness only that gives everything its value. And so Paine apparently did not have formal education in school. And I mean, this sort of betrays the underlying point here, that with the proliferation of schooling and it being eventually, after some point in history, at least in America, truancy became a crime, that if you weren't in school, you were a low-key criminal. So there was a requirement to send your kids to school. And then all the things that go with that, once you have a requirement for kids to be in school, you have a requirement for them to be vaccinated. So there's so many co-incentives aligning themselves with interests other than that of healthy, flourishing children and people and adults. And so Paine was not part of that system. Instead, what Gatto revealed to me was that there's passive literacy and there's active literacy. And passive literacy is just the ability to read, or at least read enough that, for example, you can read the rules of your workplace. You can read the laws and dictates and statutes that are put forth by your local or imperial government. And I'd say most people have that ability. You can read traffic signs and a menu and whatever's on Twitter, and that's good enough for a lot of people. Active literacy is the ability to speak and write. And if that's not taught from, rooted in the pillars of rhetoric and logic, where, as I'm alluding to here, the ability to state our beliefs, intentions, and purposes clearly. Flair is another thing entirely, and I appreciate rhetoric so much for those very reasons, is that you can add your own style. And I have rhetorical questions in here. I used to think rhetorical question just meant something that you didn't answer. Just a rhetorical question was a question that there would be no answer. And instead, the definition of that is something that is used for dramatic effect, that it's a question, it's a statement almost masquerading as a question. So we use rhetoric to our advantage to, dumbfound or confound any of our opponents in debate or people listening, so that they have to realize that to refute this question, is going to drag them further maybe into my net. It doesn't have to be so seductive as I'm making it out to be. But the point being that, I mean, I remember from school, even to the point when I was in community college and taking a public speaking course, is there's really, I mean, at most levels of secondary or advanced schooling, or schooling along the way, the ability to articulate yourself through writing. I mean, writing is just, even if you're looking for grammar and some form of adherence to whatever the MLA style and formatting is, that is certainly not encouraging people to find their own unique voice. It's certainly not encouraging people to understand the principles of communication that maybe go beyond your language. And so at one point, apparently in history, when the British Empire was especially ruling America still, it was illegal to teach active literacy. It was illegal to teach the populace how to write and speak effectively, rhetorically. And because that, if everyone could read, that's fine for the most part. We'll get to why that was a big deal with common sense here in a moment. But if people have a more active literacy, then that's where you get dissent. That's where you get real revolution, because people are able to also hear and appreciate, not just however someone is writing, also how they're speaking, their tone, their timbre, their ability to turn a phrase. And people have the intelligence, true intelligence, to appreciate all of that. That said, common sense in a populace that I think was maybe 3.5 million, and there's slaves and obviously impoverished people and all of that in different classes. I think Common Sense sold something like 600 or 700,000 copies, which meant that there was a phenomenally high literacy rate. And it's not Winnie the Pooh. It's not it's not a given easy read for anyone. I mean, I think plenty of people might not have the boredom factor almost, or just the baseline to enjoy it these days. Although it absolutely is a must read, because even just those gems that I shared, it's rife with that. And so, I was really taken aback like that from the jump that Gatto was talking about, that literacy has plummeted. And I think we know that now, that there are books that are taught in college seminar classes now that were for young children back in the day. And one of the important themes, before I continue on here, that Gatto emphasized was that until fairly recently in world history, and by world history I just mean our collective experience, our generations, whatever, that a childhood would be concluded between the ages of 7 and 11. And I'm going to speak to that here just so I don't get too far ahead of myself as I continue in my article. We might come to ask, are there any systems that benefit from the stunted evolution of its people? I have spoken and written before that the glaring incentive of a system such as Western medicine is to treat sick patients for life. Cures and continuous health are not good for business. Such a dependence on mommy medicine almost certainly guarantees that the average person will neglect the powerful influence they exact over their own health state, and therefore impede their ability to flourish and become an adult. Gatto summarizes this emphatically. Quote, "Notice what the specific mechanism is. It's an artificial extension of childhood, theoretically to the grave. And as long as you indulge childish fears and childish appetites, you've effectively rendered somebody harmless." End quote. He is speaking here of the structure of schooling, which has ulterior motives masquerading as education. Before I go on here to talk about those motives, that was supremely impactful for me, the way that was articulated. Childish fears and childish appetites being indulged for pretty much all of life. The ease, the shirking of responsibility, the fact that you can outsource so many major responsibilities and tasks for your life to other people, and then just give way to the childish fears of not being loved, or not being found cute or attractive, not being given all the treats that you want. That is really, it is an artificial extension of childhood, way beyond real childhood. And, sort of here in the States, we have the idea that until the age of 18, maybe 16-ish, 16 to 18, you're still a child, when in reality, it's very easy to remain a child for life. Children in adult bodies is the phrase that comes to mind, and there's a lot of that. And that speaks to emotional maturation, perspicacity, self-awareness, the ability to embrace rites of passage, and getting some gut checks as to how and when do we recognize that we have moved into adulthood. Which, one definition of adulthood is saying what you mean, meaning what you say, and doing it. I like that definition for many reasons. And so that, as we're about to find out, has become one of the frameworks for the education system. I continue on writing here. To wit, as articulated in a lecture given by Alexander James Ingalls, the inspiration for the Harvard School of Education, lecture entitled The Principles of Secondary Education in 1918, this describes the 6 elements that shape the modern education system: adjustive function, integrative or conformist functions, directive function, differentiating function, selective function, and the propedeutic, propedeutic function. And I'll give a brief summary of those here. The adjustive function is to create fixed habits or a predictable disposition that responds automatically to authority, the measure of which is giving stupid orders that are accepted, usually without protest. For example, you can only walk this way down the hall, for traffic in school. Even if your class is right next door, you got to walk all the way around the building. The integrative or conformist function is to make children as alike as possible, because market research requires statistical sampling that relies on generality. And we know this. I mean, this is very much, this is the inversion or the doublespeak that kids are subjected to, which is, we want you to just be yourself, but, if you do anything that is even remotely unlike the other kids that makes them feel uncomfortable, then we're going to squash that as early and effectively as possible. The directive function is diagnosing the proper social role for a child and to set them on that path for life. So that is occupations or just, your general personality is sort of cultivated with that function. And, social role, a little bit of, are you a alpha, beta, gamma, et cetera? Where do you fit in? Are you subordinate? Are you creative, even though there's not really a ton of space for that type of flourishing in school? Because, if you flourish in more of the classical arts, not, to say nothing of someone's just genuine, innate creative functions, then you're not as celebrated as much as you are if you're a STEM whiz. So the differentiating function is for a child once in a given layer of social role playing, the minimum information and education is given, not any more that would invite moving beyond that role. So differentiating, keeping kids in their lane. And this is where I talk about the cultivated ignorance is, since your world is consumed by your ability to perform in school, in that hyper-local environment, in that, where you really don't get to see beyond what the options might be, then that's where you're given the bare minimum to feed yourself. The selective function, and these last two are where it gets fairly creepy. The selective function is in reference to Charles Darwin's natural selection. So this is determining the breeding potential for children, humiliating potentially high-spirited boys and girls, and encouraging the shallowness of thinking and feeling. Also, something like sex ed is to highlight sexual pleasure and demonize it potentially, and intercourse as the peak of relating. That everyone needs to know sex ed because this is, what you're aspiring to, and you need to know how to do it. So, in any relationship, like sex ed being, you're going to have sex before marriage with random people, so you need to have an education around it. And there's no education around the immaterial that makes all relationships worthwhile. So this is something that has been laid out as an important function for the school environment, is to, of course, kids are, growing up as their hormones are developing, and they're sort of encouraged to indulge the shallowness of, however they can relate at that age. They don't really have good guidance in terms of what relating to someone of the opposite sex or same sex, but mostly opposite sex might be, and that's being steered in a particular way. Now more so than ever. I mean, just with the education around different genders and sexualities, and I mean, my takeaway is that this has no place in school. That's what families are for. That's what communities are for. And so, finally, let me see if I can get the propedeutic. The propedeutic function, from the Greek to teach beforehand. And this is perpetuating the idea, also from the world of Darwin, of favored races, improving the breeding stock by separating the ones with bad grades and putting them in remedial placement or behavior problems. And this creates a predictive function to steer the mating pool in certain currents. So this is setting the tone, propedeutic, to teach beforehand that, before you leave school, you're looking for other high achievers, or where did you go to school, and what did you study, and what are your credentials, or what are you studying in college, and you just get same. I mean, there's very little variety being promoted here. And I punctuate this by writing, the reader may notice a missing ingredient in this indigestible dish, the learning function. So of those half a dozen functions as laid forth by a gentleman who died in his early 40s, and has been credited as one of the inspirations for the Harvard School of Education, although upon request, according to John Taylor Gatto, they do not keep any records of this lecture. It had to be found elsewhere. And this is why we cannot appeal to institutions and records and all of that all the time, because people will do anything to distance themselves from their origins for plausible deniability. I mean, that is the weird game of insurance and liability shields and things I've written and spoken about before. So, but where in that did you read developing a boundless intellect and a voracious curiosity and critical thinking and logic and rhetoric and a creative function and a self-awareness function? None of that. No. This is a breeding ground for sameness and sexual selection and obedience to authority. And I will encourage you all to just explore your own thoughts and feelings on that, because I just like to go on here and not make it too much about my commentary, if I can help it. Only as needed. I mean, that was quite shocking for me, and Gatto goes into further detail just about many examples of all of those elements and how real they are in the secondary and modern schooling system. So I continue. I think education is not something received, but something taken. I have long said that my education began in earnest the day I left college. Over the last 7 years or so, my genuine intellectual curiosities, GICs, seamlessly led me to study philosophy, language, history, health, movement, astrology, and law, to name a few. The fruits of a self-guided education have required toil and investment without the external stimuli to which I was so accustomed. Those outside forces can greatly arrest the faculties of organic curiosity. My core message in this essay is this: learning is distinct from schooling. Schooling connotes all the mess described above, with the social engineering and peer pressure that demand memorization of facts as opposed to an inquisitive and interested nature. There is a chasm between memorization and understanding, between memory itself and the ability to execute. In tennis, for example, you might have memorized the technique on a high volley, but to execute down break point in an important match is another matter entirely. And Gatto harped on this consistently throughout this interview, just talking about that memorization, and he zooms out to the perspective of that at the highest levels of society, so one level being even admittance to Ivy League colleges, and then beyond that, he said, at the executive level of so many companies, it's so far less about your resume and your credentials and maybe your perceived skill set as just, do people like you? Do they like your communication style and your vibe? Because, anyone who has just a decent intellect but a good vibe is able to mesh in many different situations and be highly adaptable. Of course, I mean, we're excluding some of the engineering, and that's a point that I like to think is self-evident, which is technical education. I mean, you need that. And the environment itself is a little bit less dependent on the functions I mentioned in the social engineering. Of course, there's still, if it's medicine or chemistry or some different types of physics, there are still narratives that are the fallacial. They're rooted in logical fallacies and are just stories stacked on top of stories stacked on top of stories. But I just wanted to mention that, we're talking about liberal arts education. You can say things like that. So, but Gatto talks about that memorization, which is the hallmark of education, your ability to memorize 1 week for this test and then move on to the next. And, almost because, very few people have the ability to constantly memorize and still keep track of their own identity and their relationship to themselves and relationship to others, that you're just constantly filling the bucket and dumping it out and filling it up and dumping it out of memorization facts, that as you go on as an adult and you get more curious about what are the lies agreed upon that the victors told for history and who we are as a culture and what is true for me medicinally and health-wise, and then you start to throw out a lot of those facts and you realize how much time was genuinely wasted in this schooling environment. And yeah, it's a huge gap between what you can memorize and what you can actually execute as a skill. And often there is a lot of improvisation that takes place, and problem solving is so much of that, which you might have the template for how things might be. But a lot of people talk about that if you come from an exclusively technical background and all you think of this is the way that things should be done, then that's when it benefits an organization to have someone from outside of that world come in and offer their insight, because they have fresh eyes. And it's a cliche because it's true that those fresh eyes are often so much more valuable than people who are just so inundated with their experience within this system. I continue in this article, which I trust that you're enjoying thoroughly, even though you're getting it piece by piece and with a lot of my own commentary. Learning is a resilience to move forward, to build new paths on which we can trek into an unknown yet more promising future, not limited by this is how it's always been, as I was just saying. From my experience, there is a fragility that comes from being schooled in such stringent conditions. The expectation that the quote right, quote correct, quote factual, quote true, etc. information will be disseminated by someone with lots of answers but an intolerance for questions is one of the most egregious examples of outsourcing our innate powers that nurture perception, problem solving, and therefore resilience. Ostensibly, there is a similar sense of frailty that is based on the constant dysregulation of one's nervous system in most school settings: lack of movement, bad lighting, stifling bodily urges for relief, forced concentration, to name a few. On paper, these features of the environment seem more akin to basic training than a school for kids to grow, sourced primarily from the Prussian military paradigm for producing obedient and uniformed soldiers. I wonder if parents really intend for their children to be molded into soldiers, or if they would prefer them to be human beings. Though I am not yet a father, I know where I stand. And so this pincer maneuver here, to pull from some military jargon, is, of course, you get the obsession with memorization and being right and correct and factual according to the teacher, the authority figure that's in front of you, teachers, headmaster, whomever. And they become the disseminators. They become the, from their pulpit, they're preaching to you what it is that you should know. There's a lot of ought, ethical practices in terms of what you ought do and ought not to do. I mean, that is so much of school. And then, like I said, the intolerance for fielding questions, because, and I'm going to mention this here in a little bit, it is a shot to the ego to say, I don't know, or to have an 8-year-old kid ask you something that you've literally never thought of. And we do our best to give sympathy to these people because, I mean, anyone can be our teacher. It really is the truth. I mean, my working with juniors on the tennis court is maybe not so much information based, but they'll ask stuff like that. I mean, just to say, why do we do this? Or, especially with something as technical as tennis, and we're talking about balance in the body and how to swing with something in your hand. Mostly what they teach me is just how to communicate differently and to say things more simply and in many different ways so that different kids can receive it. And so that's highly valuable. Or I mean, like I said, they will just ask me things, whether if it's just stuff on their own mind that doesn't have to do with tennis, or stuff that I'm talking about, and they're just my gut check for that. Highly valuable, and there can still be ego resistance, and when I surrender that even a little bit, that's an opportunity to grow. And then, so the other leg of this beast is just the physical experience of in these dramatically, so much dramatic growth in these years physically. I mean, not even saying chemically and hormones and all of that, whatever those are. Again, one of the many stories that is turtles all the way down. You just talk about how kids you can just watch them physically growing and things are changing. And so for them to then do that in school, which is so anti-movement, for the most part, most schools, I should say. Terrible lighting. I mean, light is really how we know ourselves in the seasons of the time of the year and in our life as well. It's how we impact our circadian rhythm of when do we rise, when do we eat, when do we nap? When do we connect? When do we start winding down? All of that stuff. So with the lighting that's in most places, I mean, it bashes that sensitivity. It totally numbs it. The stifling of bodily urges. Didn't you just go to the bathroom? Are you just trying to get out of class? And kids, they, depending on what they're eating and drinking, and they probably have to go to the bathroom a lot anyway. And there's nothing wrong with relieving yourself the moment you feel that urge. And I mean, I'm sensitive to it too, and I know I've talked about it before, that for the most part we have been trained not to, so we can just grind through. I had to poop, half an hour ago, or I had to pee an hour ago, and I'm just holding it because, then I got to get right to my next class because I've got 5 minutes and I got to get there early and, study a little bit extra before we sit down for the quiz and all that kind of stuff, which just takes you completely out of the self-awareness of the brilliance of your body. And then forced concentration. I mean, yes, concentration is a skill. It is an easier skill to employ when you're learning about something that you love and are drawn to, not pulled toward out of forced necessity. So, I mean, yeah, I understand all of the criticisms around how concentration is lacking, and I mean, we can see a lot of the reasons why. Just that the appetite, the diet that most kids are fed in terms of media is dependent on distraction and short attention span. And so all understandably so. Like I said, it's more so a skill that's worth developing, that kids learn how to just really lean into the things that they aren't second guessing, that they feel the magnetism of that. And that's what John Taylor Gatto was promoting in his schools. He talked about that when he started and was given one curriculum for 26 kids, he worked on cultivating 26 curricula for those kids to follow their own genuine intellectual curiosities. And that is a valiant task, no matter where you are. I continue here. I asked someone recently, do you think school is a place for kids to flourish? The idea that flourishing was even on the table was a bit startling, even as it occurred to me. But isn't that what childhood is supposed to be all about? The burst of life, the accelerated growth that comes from experience, trial and error, the bounce back that most children find is their natural way of being. I see it as a tall order for a tree to grow tall and strong if there is a ceiling over its head. Another significant factor in the bewildering experience of boarding a school bus and being banished from home from years on end is the abuse of logical fallacies. And I link to an excellent website that is a resource for just short summaries of what all the different types of logical fallacies are, and there are many. And they occupy a major presence in our lives, I think you'll find. To name a few: appeal to authority, appeal to emotion, begging the question, bandwagon, false dichotomy. If a curious child should be so brazen as to ask, how do you know that? They are almost always met with a logical fallacy. To say instead, I actually don't know for sure, is anathema to most of us, let alone someone expected to deliver answers, rationale, and reasons professionally as a teacher. Yes, knowledge, as we know, is a moving target, so there is a wide berth for all of us in the earnest pursuit of more experience and awareness. I also trust that most teachers do their best to enlighten rather than darken the mental faculties of their pupils. Still, we suffer collectively from the assumption that most of our world is solved or solvable, and all that is left is to print the findings in a textbook, test people, and sort out the non-believers from there. For all the valid criticisms of religious fanaticism, the ranks of education are populated with cult-like leaders, administrators, and followers, swept up in the currents of go along to get along, closely resembling the churchgoers they so openly mock. And so I'll talk about science here in a moment. Education, like science, because so much of it is impacted by science, if it's social science or statistics or anything like that, is reliant on logical fallacies that deny. But false dichotomy is such a popular one. It's either this or that. And of course, in this magical realm, it can be at least numerous other things to say, nothing of infinite possibilities. And I mean, I get it. Those are scary. And, you might say these are the best we know, but then you can say best by what standard? And so there's an intellectual curiosity that needs to be embraced. It's just like, hey, these are the stories from people, and it's up to you to, if you have a different story, start to work on that, and we'll see how it stacks up with logic and empirical evidence and all those kinds of things. We can absolutely be standards. And instead, what we get are logical fallacies, and if you don't adhere to these logical fallacies, you're the non-believer. And non-believers should be shunned, and they should be punished, and they should be ostracized. And that's really what makes it so cult-like. I continue here. Since it is the fashion of our time to reduce everything, quote, down to a science, that should put science under the microscope. The field of science itself has a neurotic obsession with claiming unconditional certainty over a vast many subjects, many of which are simply stories stacked upon assumptions based upon conjecture. Even Albert Einstein conceded as much, acknowledging the essence of theorizing as storytelling. This, regrettably, leaves little room for non-believers, and further supports the rigidity of systems that, without a good old-fashioned stretch every once in a while, leads to atrophy and degeneration. Inflexibility is what creates stagnation. Stagnation leads to disease and death. All systems are alive if populated by people. So any system which refuses to adapt, grow, recognize error, and improve is destined for a steep decline. Science has staked its claim in mechanization and anti-life philosophies, so I do not take my guidance from that pulpit anymore. And I used to. I had a time that was obsessed with neuroscience and so many mechanistic explanations for the world. A little bit of got caught up a little bit in the space worship and all the stories that make no sense. And it's fine to have mystery. Just don't tell me that the sun is 36 billion miles away and we're hurtling through space at tens of thousands of miles per hour at a 23-degree tilt, and we're really turning. Gravity is this factor of 5 different spins and motions all at once. I mean, when you're told shit like that, it's to disconnect you, it's to numb you and detach you and say, well, I don't get it, so I'm not going to waste my energy trying to get it. I'm just going to say, sounds good, and if I can regurgitate that on a test, it's all good. This essay in its current iteration is not meant to expose the myriad myths that are propagated in the walls and halls of the average school. More on these later. As a self-proclaimed history buff, I've had to reckon with the scars from my AP European history course, in which my skepticism on numerous multiple-choice exams was met with vehement denouncement and less than excellent marks. I just remember, multiple choice meaning I am choosing multiple choices. I know there's a couple that don't make sense here, but these sound like they could be plausible, but even based on the story that we were given, and also saying, well, these things don't make sense. I mean, and, just getting bad marks and then fretting about that and, trying to, I remember a couple of times, offering my counter arguments for why I thought that my answers were correct. And, then maybe a concession on 1 of 10, and I wasn't just doing it to, at least as far as I know, I mean, probably a lot of it was just, to get a little bit of a better grade, but, I answered what I thought was rightly at the time. Since my interest was not extinguished, the fire remains to this day. And I continue to unlearn many false narratives that have shaped our understanding of the, quote, right side of history, as if history has a side. For now, just consider the Civil War, also known as the War of Northern Aggression, as an example. And this I got a lot out of listening to John Taylor Gatto in his interview. Almost unilaterally, it is taught as a war fought over the issue of slavery. Any precursory internet search now would reveal that the conflict had much more to do with debt and monetary policies, foreign interests, and social engineering that turned Americans into industrialists rather than entrepreneurs. This alone is cause to question the way people view themselves and their place in time. And yeah, the Civil War, because it was, as with so many wars, a launch point for things taking a totally different track in our country. One of the big ones that Gatto talked about was that prior to that, we had, economy is another made-up word. There's really just how people relate in community. Because the whole globalism and productionism, and you can have mass-scale production, whether it's farming or oil or steel or whatever. The type of things talked about in Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged. You can still have those, and it can still be highly entrepreneurial. And it doesn't have to be the type of, because the capitalism we have now is not real capitalism. I don't know if we've ever seen it, because it has so many elements of socialism, communism, control by the government. So it's not really what we think of, which is, part of what we had from the inception of what we know as the United States of America up until the Civil War, was highly entrepreneurial and hyper localized. That even if there wasn't a blacksmith per man or per family, when you went to go be, you would go be an apprentice, or you respected that master blacksmith so much that you would work for him, and still you had very much the ability, you felt like you were working for yourself. It wasn't quite the indentured servitude that has been proliferated in the tellings of what slavery was like and what just general working was like. I mean, slavery was slavery, to be sure, although we have a very dramatized version of slavery. And I mean, just you read even something like Gone with the Wind, or so many tales out of the Reconstruction of the South, that a lot of slaves preferred to go back to their plantations because they were cared for, because they had food and domicile, and shelter, and they were with their families. I mean, the idea of splitting up all I think a lot of that is overblown, because I mean, there were plenty of incentives for plantation owners to keep families together. I mean, granted, at some point, a lot of those families were mulatto kids because of the masters. And I mean, that stuff is definitely fucked up. And I mean, it's not fucked up just because you're mixing races. It's just if it was anything like rape, or that because I'm your master, you submit. I mean, no one has any right to subject another human being to that. So plenty of bad. I'm I don't know if it balances out the good, but this is where we are tasked with taking a different look than what we're. I mean, there's some rap songs I'm forgetting, but they talk about just how every year there's a slave movie. That was super popular for a time. 12 Years a Slave, Oscar winner. And it just reinforces that story to the point where, and the brain, such as it is, or the mind, is not always able to distinguish between what is fake and what is real. So if you've seen 12 Years a Slave, it's almost like you're living it now. I mean, it's because it's brought into your present, and you're not really distinguishing that from what may or may not have been in the past. So yeah, I mean, this is very scientific to say that it's all been settled. Science is settled. History is settled. We've got the story, and this is the one that you need to know. There's very little need to know out there. I'm going to bring us home because I am famished and would like to honor that bodily urge, to be sure. And you can also read this and develop your own commentary and criticism. And I welcome feedback. I don't get any better with people telling me how great I am, even though I don't get very little of that. So I'd much prefer people talking about and sharing with me what they see, whatever my words and reflections made you think and feel. That's highly valuable to me, for sure. My conclusion here. And so we find ourselves in the present, a gift if there ever was one. The most confronting question at hand is it working? Or, to pull from Native American lore, the exactitude of this question is really, does it grow corn? If you salt the ground where the corn is meant to grow, the crop dies. If, however, you douse the rows of plantings with glyphosate, the corn will still grow, but it is likely to carry within itself a subtle toxicity for whomever consumes it. So one might say that, yes, of course, the school system is producing flourishing children, well-adjusted and ready to change the world. Look how tall those stalks of corn have grown. Well, I would ask, how can one change the world when reared inside the very system that ensures compliance and obedience to the ones dependent on things remaining the same? How can you produce toxic food and still claim that it will nourish the world? From my perspective, these rhetorical questions reveal the dwindling vitality of children as generations enter the ranks of their local schools, and emerge as vulnerable victims to be sacrificed at the altar of the status quo. My vocation in this life is to support vitality, and that has led me to understanding topics such as natural law, money, social engineering, and education, because I see how early the assault on the life force begins. The resilience derived from unlearning so much of what has been foisted upon us is indescribably liberating. I have found the greatest transformations in my life have come from relinquishing what I thought I knew, or really believed, and stepping into a new story, one that usually has much more color than the previous black and white version. No classroom, no authority figure required. Simply an open heart and mind and voracious hunger for truth will suffice for the rest of this journey. Yours truly, Tomfoolery. So I thank you all for walking with me through that. I am very proud that I put that out, and it sort of came not off the cuff. I'm editing all the while, and I take a lot of care to be careful, to be full of care as I do something like that. Is because it's really alive for me right now, and that's why I write about this kind of stuff. And yeah, I mean, please read it again. Please share it. Please criticize it, comment on it. All that stuff is valuable to me, not just for growth and for spreading my reach, but because it helps me sharpen these skills of communication and what I can do better to meet people where they're at. And yeah, I mean, a little bit of reflection on that. You know, when I use that metaphor of does it grow corn, does it work? I mean, if you planted those seeds, does it actually sprout a stalk, and can that stalk nourish you? And I think it's a worthy extension of that metaphor to say that, I mean, yeah, because we have, look, there's food. Like that's an ear of corn in the grocery store. That's an apple. What's the matter if it was grown with a ton of pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, rodenticides, glyphosate in its soil, and it's been modified and it's a hybrid? And I mean, the difference is that you are not then getting the benefit of what could be the maximal vitality from the energy, because that energy, it's lost its energy. It may look like an apple, but at some point it's going to be like looking at an apple on a TV screen. You can't eat that shit. So you get kids that they look like kids, and they look like, they look buttoned up and well groomed and well adjusted. And I'm reminded of, I forget the person who came up with that quote, but it's no sign of health to be well adjusted to a sick society. And that's really what we're talking about here, is children are being adjusted and directed into a very ill society. And then, it's tough. It's a big ask to say, then go change the world, because all you know is the world as it's been shown to you, that this is the way it's always been and always will be, because we're making it so with these structures, because we cannot afford to have revolution, because we cannot afford to have people, who are truly various and veritable in themselves, that they don't conform, that they're not like other kids. And that really is the truth of it. However, I mean, that we are all snowflakes. I mean, this is what's funny about so much of the woke agenda. I mean, I even take things like transgenderism, is that, yes, I mean, we all absolutely have masculine and feminine qualities within us. I'm speaking energetically, and what it means to be masculine, to go be aggressive and forceful and willful in the world, to lead with the phallus, to be externally oriented, and then to be internally oriented, intuitive. Of course, men cannot create life. I mean, that's where physiologically we have that separation, of course. But, the feminine qualities of being intuitive, being focused on healing, being focused on community. I mean, we all have that capacitance within us. It's not about just the sex element. And so, I mean, these are the things that I can see through, just with the languaging, and then how it manifests with something like that. And then also, everyone's a snowflake and everyone has the right to be different. Yes, absolutely. That is the gift of our life. And yet we have this whole world that chops down the tall trees. It needs every tree to be at the same height and the same species and and think the same and behave the same and have the same relationship to authority, because it's been cultivated over their lifetimes from the jump, from the years where we are the most impressionable, where we are distracted from learning about ourselves because we're too busy worrying about stuff. I know I've spoken about this before, that Rudolf Steiner was one of the first ones to promote and he was the inspiration for Waldorf schooling, spearheading that type of schooling. And I'm going to speak probably on another podcast about solutions and another article as well, that, okay, let's say you feel like your only option is to send your kids to a public school. Then the onus is back on you as a family or as a community to say, well, what are we going to unlearn, and how are we going to come up with a game plan to navigate the trials of school? I mean, that's just taking more ownership instead of letting someone else raise your kids and tell them who they are. No, let's talk about, how do you really know yourself? I mean, how are you really going to cultivate a rich inner life? Because kids absolutely have that ability. And Steiner was the one who talked about that if you're teaching your kids the highly logical or mechanistic skills before the age of 7, then you've completely stymied and stifled their creative abilities, their intuitive abilities, their self-awareness, because they're so hyper-focused on, what is 1 + 3, and, the B makes what sound, and that word. And I mean, yeah, even things like spelling and reading, those things people can learn at any age. I mean, because someone said, well, but what, a kid is really just going to start to learn how to add and subtract and spell and read at the age of 7 or 8? What about what's the rush? You have a whole life. And I mean, my recent pursuits have been physical skills, teaching myself how to juggle and play tennis with my left hand, and, realizing that we're given, we have 2 arms and 2 legs for a reason. We can't just do everything. The idea of a dominant hand is becoming anathema to me, because, what about the other hand? We can absolutely learn how to do things with the left hand. It can be tougher the more life we have, and just the reliance that we have from doing things the same with, our one hand. But yeah, imagine just going through life with just one hand and ignoring the left. Like, what if, you're trying to hug someone, or you're trying to pick something up, and you feel like all you have is one hand to do it? I mean, that really is what is taught to kids from the jump, with the expectation that they memorize and recite and regurgitate, just this subset of skills, and not then develop. Because what you could develop by, just having the experience of relationship and your self-awareness is a wide openness. And that openness is what helps us feel truly empowered. And yeah, as I said, my vocation in this life is to support vitality and empowerment. So that's why I do this podcast. That's why I write about these things of import and significance to me, because I see that they are important and significant to others as well, because it's a universal experience of how do we learn, not just how and where do we go to school, and what's jammed down our throats in that environment. So more solutions to come, to be sure. For the rest of you who are second guessing your schooling time, just remain curious, and go take your own education however you can for yourself, because that's where all the magic happens. So until next time, I, as always, appreciate you investing your energy and attention. Please share this podcast. Please share the Substack, and any feedback that you can share with me personally, I welcome it. That is an appetite. That is a diet that I absolutely have room for this time of year. So wishing you all the very best in every and anything that you do.